Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye Rosoi quan lai puje tarze yen lai tuje yong den song do dare che do nyamo nyen no le je cha do ron ze chen ma re me zre du mar nyu go jin ye chen ze ra de nam de ne da sa je tar sen yen den lu zo ja ze tu go Chödrak Chödrak Chöni Jende Dalmas Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye Chenra Özreje Dalö Temo Membarasrane Kadan Tenjö Jonglo Topaye Lodrö Pobe Nongwa Zaldo So Nimbe baden jeden som dora tambe chora singe da ba tamje jimba kunchon zen shalo zong zo ga norve to dungar ja zo tin da me garwa roe zo la je ja za lo sarap gando se ya dan yele tamge sam sha yong zong xin chang chim yin be lam gen karma ba me je de chi we zo ge du la so tene Samba shong chup cho de semje Rinpoche saltam ne tambe chosen ronang.
So please begin by arousing the heartfelt aspiration to awaken the body mind.
Ta 다른 건저 의식의 가르치기 어디서나 가장 주변한 신체 택배 고군을 뒤바 Songrab Rinpoche Tse Lapasam Lakpar Tempe Tenchu Shejak Kunchap Nang Ne Tene Shilagna Jo Thaye Ma Chitang Chukuyore.
So the topic of this course is taken from a writing by Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye. Its complete title is A Resume of All Paths, a Precious Treasury that sets forth those teachings and topics and the three trainings. A treatise which encompasses all that is known or all objects of knowledge. And the specific topic for the course is found in the 8th chapter of this treatise, which sets forth the stages of meditation of shamatha and vipassana, the general basis of all samadhis.
Tachidan Shejan Zage Tingjun de la Liu Jui Dan Jinre.
Now, the treatise itself is made up of 10 chapters.
Then chapter Rignang la Dancing Kechewa Yi Yichen Sungyore.
And in each chapter, one finds 4 specific points in terms of what is explained or taught.
Tene, that chapter Tangboda which is Chashana. Tene, it's a tea or Marabo. Tangboda with the Jitin come de Chakchu Kanda Yimba, Telanda Jitindi. Chetan Direta Sanji Chik Durjin Churbe, Jitinji Comptonso, Chatham Kandes Chag.
Sanji Chik Gi Dulshin Sundu da Deb Chikla Shing Mandra Mandrala, Sangye Mandra Mandra Pebeore Kogo Girwe.
Re Penadire, Sanji Shachatuba Chike, Dulcin, Shinkam Mendrawala, Shachatuba Kui Namjur Dram, Midragon, Tanzegi, or what Tizokanka show them.
Re Dihinayang Te Sangye Shachatupe Mayimbe, Sangye Yang Dulshin Kaka Yang.
Teta Petape.
Debchikla Yorva.
Yor.
In addition, just so Nangla de
Sangye
Shakshatupa Chikurva. So, the first of the 10 chapters sets forth the stages of coming into existence of the world systems in which Buddha Shakyamuni manifests and sets forth the Buddha Dharma. The details of how these world systems came to be, one could perhaps put that in the context of the topic called cosmology, where you find explanations of how a world system comes to be. And here it is about the world systems within which Buddha Shakyamuni has worked and lived. And this chapter, as all the other chapters, sets forth 4 points as to the explanations of the chapter in question.
Tumbe Thoma Shonjuk Chodu Tu Jetang Kandes Jeyuba
Sangye Shakya
Ya Partu Sonam Tang Yishi Choni Chedar Sak Chu Tama De Sheratu Maranzu Shinkam Digela Zambilin Dinang Temben Zapachuni Kitsur Donchu Tensol Layang Yesu Mentama Mango Yongiore, that turns in Jiganand doing the Leuni backup temper.
Not Dunson Sum Matomeduta. Dang Po Chanchukisen Tomar Kepa, Ni Pade, Sonam Yeshi Gitsoni Sata, Tene Sumpate Digikten, Sambuling Digikting La Sepachuni Tensul. This
Sumrawa, this some la take Trumtaki Shetu Midawa Yorba, Nintubege, take some Shetu,
yes,
taking Tumuma be Shetu, then Hane Song tu, Lamit Zopachimbo Song tu.
Then they she parave.
Madam,
Don't she raise?
Don't see ye said the Shed Tanda Tesumra, Sonchu to Jesu.
This sum read one.
This sum do what Tessum said Tangati Gelsem, my jabda. Dash on to two Jesu the Lanito Shetang Giore, Teshin Shetang Giore, Kana Song Giore, Zoshinka Song Giore.
And?
Tin do yet today. She yet Sonchu the two Jesu, so
then so soon. She Tene Dunson she Niente Tekchen Nga Gilame Utsochen. Kandere.
Our teacher.
Dampo Lamere, so.
Madame Tangbo
Marie
Lami zokpa chimbo chebre.
Lame zokpa chimbo. Lame matsusung. Okay. So, in terms of the second chapter, the explanations concern details as to the various perspectives of the life example of Buddha Shakyamuni. The perspective of how and when he, for the first time, in a previous lifetime of course, awakened to the Bodhi mind and committed to the path of a Bodhisattva in consequence of having awakened to the presence of the Bodhi mind within. As well as the perspective of Buddha Shakyamuni's efforts in terms of him perfecting what is known as the two accumulations of merit and wisdom. And the perspective of him taking rebirth in our world system, in Sanskrit referred to or as or having the name Jambudvipa, and how Buddha Shakyamuni manifested as an enlightened Buddha by way of the 12 deeds of a historic Buddha. Now, in terms of the 4 points, these perspectives are explained to begin with in the context of Theravada Buddhism, then second of the 4 points in the context of Mahayana Buddhism, then the third of the 4 points in the context of the Buddhist Tantras at large, and then number 4 in the context of the Mahāti system.
Tene ta leu sumbe kaptala sanje gi chö khari yimba ngösung
Sanje ki chö khari
sanje sabje tube chö sinkete kandeji le songbiyo.
In the third chapter, there are explanations regarding what the Buddha Dharma is. Sangye Shakya
Tube
Sangye Shakya Tupe's Chö Songpa Te Kanyin Kongyin.
Kanyin Kongyin Tang Tene Yema Sanje Nyangenan Da Sardu Chö de Daku Jebtang Kandeshi Jagwe.
As well as how, after the passing of Buddha Shakyamuni, his heirs preserved the Buddha Dharma that he had set forth.
Da leusumba gitin tere tele nang segi shedang yeyued.
And of course, again, there are various subdivisions in this chapter, but in general, that's what chapter 3 sets forth.
Tene leusumba leu yebatela ta tambe chö yagartu kante shongwa phele kante shongwa otta tinju koshe.
Then, in chapter 4, Jamgön Kongtrül sets forth the details as to how the sacred Buddha Dharma spread throughout the Indian subcontinent, as well as in Tibet. The fifth chapter explains or sets forth, rather, the first of the three trainings as to the Buddha's doctrine, that of ethics. Sotar, changsem, songa. And here the 4 points concern expositions of, or setting forth, the framework of the so-called individual liberation tradition. 2, the framework of the path of a bodhisattva, framework and details, and the framework and details of the secret mantrayana. And the 4th point explains how, with respect to these various traditions, a practitioner who has contradicted his path, who has failed to uphold the ethics of his path and so on, how he is to go about acknowledging his downfall or downfalls, and then what he needs to do in order to rectify or repair or amend the failings on his part. Just a second. Sådan sova.
Sova sing the main.
Men. Tene?
Tene darikpa.
Or to maintain, to heal.
Tene darikpa.
Darikpa.
Lecture gay.
Drag it open.
Yeah.
Tene?
Tene temarikpa.
Sema. Then you have the 6th chapter, and its 4 subdivisions, which are the following. 1, the art of healing, that is to say, a medical system, or many of them perhaps. There might be alternative systems, not just one. Then you have number 2, which is about various crafts, painting, statue making, and the like. Then there is number 3, which is the topic of linguistics. Apparently that primarily here deals with the Sanskrit language. And then there is the 4th topic of this chapter, which is about the theory or theories of knowledge, epistemology, and associated logic and reasoning. And these 4 topics are, in terms of the Buddha Dharma, part of training in so-called higher knowledge. And here one finds quite a number of details in terms of this training, the training in higher knowledge.
Very simple page in a sugar. Teachings darnaya dartong chuncho song.
It's very inclusive, as it were, this exposition of training in higher knowledge, authored by Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye. It even gives the instructions as to how a person can sharpen the blade of his knife, which is a type of craft, and it requires some specific knowledge in order to be able to do this right. As well as the instructions of how to, for example, beat a drum properly.
Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye
Apparently, at one point, Jamgön Kongtrül himself, in a conversation with another person, had asked the person in question, "Do you know how to sharpen a knife?" And this person had said, "Yes, I do." And Jamgön Kongtrül had then asked him, "Who taught you how to do this properly?" The man had answered, "I figured it out myself. I didn't have anyone showing me how to do this." To which Jamgön Kongtrül had responded, "Well, personally, I wouldn't seek out or seek the advice of a person who claims to have knowledge of something that was never taught to him." So in terms of Jamgön Kongtrül himself and the instructions as to how to sharpen the blade of a knife that he wrote down in the treatise, before doing so, before writing these instructions down, he did seek the advice of a person, expert person, in terms of how to sharpen the blade of a knife. And Jamgön Kongtrül himself held this man in high esteem. He had a lot of respect for this person who had kindly taught him how to sharpen the blade of a knife properly. So, whatever instructions one seeks, whatever the topic is, a simple one or a more complex one, makes no difference. Prior to seeking the instructions, one has to make sure that the instructor has a line of transmission as to what he teaches. And as his student, one should, because of him kindly giving the instructions, have respect for the person in question, even though the topic or the craft, whatever, may be a very simple one.
Tintu Panatan doesn't jictin be shejarwa. Jictin and David Sheja, Nangpe Churchi Yinata, that Jupayang Gogre, Ted Dunking, that Kandeji in a Tajaji in a Telemoning as in Cuba Nangore. Jupayunki, Gagin the Cuba Shinking Yuna, Shugishin, Latian, Consati Jula, Ju Sont.
So, in the context of worldly topics, like the craft of how to sharpen the blade of the knife and so on and so forth, there are many other crafts and topics in the context of the world. If one needs to have that kind of respect and need to make sure that one's teacher belongs to a proper line of transmission, if that holds true for worldly crafts, sciences and the like, then one can just start to imagine that it may be even more important in terms of other worldly topics, such as instructions as to how liberation from samsara can be achieved and the like. Even though one's instructor or teacher may be a very humble person who belongs to a proper line of transmission, even though the person in question may not have great fame, renown and the like, one should realize that he is deserving of one's heartfelt respect because of him kindly giving the instructions that he gives, instructions of a proper or belonging to a proper line of transmission.
Olas, Tine, that live Dumbate, Mixel Glapashirap Glabenane, Namba Sanje Bege, Cortes on
Then there is the 7th chapter, which sets forth the training of higher knowledge in the context of Buddhism.
Tene live Jepate, Tan Namba Sanje Luge, Tingenzinge, Course on
And the 8th chapter sets forth the details of so-called samadhi, stable meditation states, also in the context of Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine. And the 9th chapter sets forth presentations of the 10 levels of a bodhisattva, the 10 bodhisattva bhumis. And the 10th chapter sets forth the details of the goal of the path. And the 8th chapter, as was said, sets forth different types of samadhi, the various stages of meditation, in the context primarily of Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine. Now, if you were to ask Khenpo Rinpoche what the line of transmission is that he holds in terms of those teachings, he would tell you the following.
Jamgön Lodrö Thaye Poma Sovete Sheshin Yatsa Rinpoche Insare Samkudu Menayang
Shechen
Yatsap
Shechen Gombarwa
Rede
Shechen Gyalsap
Did Menayang that Lodrö Thaye Shalop Chikundone Tenten Simare.
He would tell you that he himself received the transmission of Chödrak, the Treasury of Knowledge authored by Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, from the late Dingo Chense Rinpoche, who in turn had received the transmission presumably from one of the main disciples of Jamgön Kongtrül himself, Shechen Gyaltsap, or perhaps another disciple of Jamgön Kongtrül himself.
The India Shuit to say young Nakalba Sangbo Kaisana. Captedu Lamasole to Ditagase your mare, Lomasole Tla your mare, Lele Shujuchon.
Kadirebo.
Peshe don't you temper lolly inside her? Don't you touch lolly inside her?
Khenpo Rinpoche says he was very fortunate in terms of the circumstances of the giving of the transmission, because it was at a time when lamas, Rinpoches, reincarnates weren't very busy. Also, disciples of them weren't very busy, which is more of the norm today. This was in 1971, where most high reincarnate lamas, Rinpoches, their disciples, had time enough to, in an orderly and longer period than today fashion, were able to receive various transmissions.
That church robe, Chedro Layang, that Hindu, dancing Jebu Chimbo, Nime Shobi, Mang Chevatigu, Konabas Gondoche, Jonga, Chödrak Cabre, that Zonsar Chinze say and Shechin Ranjam say and
there were also many others, of course, who received the same transmission, and many of them are today quite well known and are primarily of the Nyingma school. At the time they were rather young, 15, 16 years old. Some examples would be, two examples would be Tsongsa Chense Rinpoche as well as Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche and others.
Lasso. Tene, Tayin Jamgön Lodrö Thaye na Nanying Parul, Minima Toyo Mada.
Ah?
Jamgön Lodrö Thaye da nganying partala minni ma to yomare.
So, in terms of the line of transmission of the Shijiazhu, authored by Jamgön Kongtrül, there are only 2 generations between the Khenpo and Jamgön Kongtrül, i.e. the disciple of Jamgön Kongtrül who gave the transmission to Dingo Chense and Dingo Chense himself.
Tene ta kon number nika chönyi dang sum du zik sum lamak ni re. Shashin jatsa wina chönyi dang sum du zik yore Dingo Chense yina chönyi dang sum du zik sum.
And both of them, Shechen Gyaltsab and Dingo Chense, are individuals who had insight of the true nature of all things. So, extraordinary individuals.
Tinde tang nge jupa ta ma sona jupa sang bo re.
So, Khenpo Rinpoche tells you that his line of transmission is a rather special one.
Tang ngaran na te na soche thamal parang re.
However, Khenpo Rinpoche himself, he says, is an ordinary person. There is nothing special about him himself, he says.
La so ta kong tu pe na zo da de la pa sher la pa chutim ji la pa tang la pa herap ji la pa ni ten ne de la nge pa che char ne ta nge par tu gam kur ma to pheng ma re song the.
Dadi ge pa de tingi tingi la pa.
Yes.
Tene kare song song do.
Di ngwa la. La pa sherap ji la pa tang.
Tingi tingi ngola.
Ngwa.
You have
La pa chutim ji la pa ni.
you have the 3 trainings of ethics, higher knowledge, and in samadhi. Now, a person prepares himself for training in samadhi by way of first training in primarily ethics and higher knowledge.
Tande namba sanje chilu jamgön ge mixe khayam mare.
And that's the norm. As to Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine, it's not a norm set forth by the author, Jamgön Kongtrül.
Penna sanje ge do yu nika ge namba. Rang la tingen sing.
La?
Rang la tingen sing. Yaku che go na ti ju chutim tang sheram ni song.
Buddha Shakyamuni explained on many occasions, which is recorded in both the sutras and in the tantras, that for a practitioner to be able to train in samadhi, he has to, prior to that training, prepare himself for that training by way of training in ethics and higher knowledge, the 2 being the 2 courses for proper training in samadhi.
Penna jub me halan rev che go na te che thab yo marwa.
You see, in order to develop in a specific field, now we're looking at the field of samadhi, you need to do what would cause you to develop in the training of samadhi for that to happen. Because you can't achieve a result of any kind if you haven't engaged in efforts that would cause the specific result to happen. Results do not happen causelessly, as it were. So you need to figure out how you need to start in terms of doing something when you have the ambition to achieve a specific result.
Last word. The ne yepa lapa tingen sing lapa shepa la danda ye.
And in this chapter, the 8th chapter, which sets forth the training in samadhi, there are, as is the case with all other chapters, 4 points made in terms of the explanations or the presentation.
That dancing tangbut karren to do tang. Tingen changma ke xie yin ra wo de xine dang lak tong sing ge ting yin ba re. Di ni ji xie ra wo chi.
So the first of the 4 points of this chapter sets forth the stages of meditation of shamatha and vipassana, the general basis of all samadhi, the two being the general basis of all samadhis.
Tan de song yon de pen na ngaran zo tingen sing ge de kari yin ba ti dong bu ngo zhe nang di yo shi.
Na?
Tingen tan gam jeb sing do ten jing de pa yuk che. Meditation sing do. Meditation thinking ti kande ra wo chi la la gi yo ba the ngo zhe nang di yo.
So here the reader or the student is introduced to what meditation in fact is. People talk a lot about meditation. And here it's in specific the details of Buddhist meditation and what that kind of meditation is.
Perna nga zupo dia zo che nge dong te kunda chi sha nge te gam de gi sawate ngone meditation chasang chi cha yo ma zopta lo chi ma.
So one needs to have the instructions, all the instructions, as to the meditation one plans to do or practice. It isn't enough to sit down in a certain physical posture on a meditation cushion and focus on an object of meditation, for example, a Buddha statue that one has placed in front of one, on a table in front of one, and sort of try to focus on that statue and nothing else. This is not actual Buddhist meditation to do just that. It's rather, what would the word be? It looks like Buddhist meditation, but is not actual Buddhist meditation. It may look like a Buddhist meditation practice, and the person who does this may think it is. However, it is not an actual Buddhist meditation to do that alone or just that. So, to begin with, as to the 8th chapter, the author introduces the reader to the two main types of Buddhist meditation, in Sanskrit known as shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha approximately is about one-pointed attention as to an object of meditation, and vipassana is in general about using various methods by way of which the practitioner gains insight of the true nature of the mind and all other things.
Yeah.
And in the context of shamatha, the purpose of the one-pointed attention is to calm the mind so that a calm and clear mindset is achieved, which permits the practitioner to acquire insight of the true nature.
Oh yeah, that dancing nipate.
Oh, dancing nipa, okay.
Karsong arsana. You sing tepe garam sherak temba song.
Then we have the second of the 4 points of this chapter, which sets forth the details of the so-called Sutrayana, where the various practices and methods, the purpose of them is to attain enlightenment. However, on the basis of these methods and practices, a rather long time, or it would require the practitioner a rather long periods of time throughout many lifetimes to attain enlightenment. For these practices and methods to cause the enlightenment of the practitioner. So this is sort of a long-term path, as it were.
long-term senayang gamtong yakuch shinkin yuna short-term yang rotubeji ungyot.
However, of course, a gifted practitioner may achieve, on the basis of this path, enlightenment within a much shorter period of time than what applies to practitioners at large. It's not to say that you cannot. What was just said is not synonymous with saying that on the basis of this path it always is the case that it takes a very long time to achieve enlightenment. Not at all. It depends on the individuals and their capacities.
Last one. Tati kab you sing tepa song kab you nekap ye nekap la dembani ktsini kari yimba teten la pabgi.
Deni it's
yeah.
Shilan Rebu de se komari.
Tati tangbo jutsi
So
tepa
here, this path, the Sutrayana, primarily sets forth the details of the so-called two truths, relative truth and absolute truth, and the characteristics of the two truths.
어다 데니 근네수
Therefore, this path is also referred to as the path, and then understood, which primarily sets forth the characteristics of the two truths in the context of methods and practices which cause a practitioner to make progress on the path to enlightenment, as well as with respect to practitioners attaining enlightenment.
다소 대체 유 예내갑 데니 그 남자한테 야고 신경 공사 되게 따뜻 남는 자롱데 감람 송아래.
So the practitioner here first needs to acquire knowledge of all the characteristics of the two truths, relative and absolute. And with that knowledge as his basis, he can enter the meditative path where the knowledge is then internalized to the point where insight of the true nature of reality in its two perspectives, or in the perspectives of relative reality and absolute reality, can be attained.
벤 시장제는 대송도와 유 신이 택배 감름 셋업셰바스 딱 람진내갑데 감빈내갑으로와
So the basis for the practitioner here is that kind of knowledge, and the path is about using that knowledge, as was just described, in the context of a path of meditation. And so this is what causes the individual, the practitioner, to make progress on the path and eventually attain enlightenment. And that's the second of the 4 points that this chapter sets forth. So you have the stages of meditation as to this path set forth then in the context of the second of the 4 points of this chapter. Then there is the third, which sets forth the stages of meditation in the context of the secret mantrayana, also known as the Vajrayana. La? Yeah.
도제 택배게 람데 데네 신도 송화체네 냠는 고기.
And the name secret mantrayana, the word secret, points to the fact that practitioners of the Vajrayana path need to, or are expected to, keep their practices, efforts, experiences, achievements, and so on private, secret. It's not; these are not to be topics in conversations with all sorts of people.
내가 나신게 도지 택배기 최대 냠솔린 킹게 공사들라야. 닌떡 유연킹, 쓰남 유연킹, 감각 고비.
And a person suited for this approach would be a person with certain qualities such as great courage, someone of high standards as to virtue, merit and the like.
Penna doji take pege lamgin juko tungpote wang senkinderwa.
Now the beginning of the path called the Vajrayana or the secret Vajrayana is that of an empowerment, receiving an empowerment.
Te ten nangking gin lama Quran layang Jerem la temba top.
Jerem la temba top.
Top. Zorem la treji yeshi jewa. Tama layang.
Treji yeshi da de
Jolam gi yeshi.
Jolam gi dang pura va?
Yeah. Tama yang tendra wachi gogi yor. Tama tille.
Now the person, the master who gives the empowerment must have progressed to a certain level for it to be appropriate at all for him to give the empowerment. In fact, it is not permitted to perform an empowerment unless the following has been achieved on the part of the person who gives the empowerment. The very minimum requirements are the following, namely that this person must have attained what is referred to as a level of stability in the context of the stages of meditation that which are about meditating on oneself as a yidam and the enlightened world of the yidam, as well as in terms of level of realization as to the person who gives the empowerment. The very minimum requirement is that this person has achieved the first level, the first of the four levels of the path of unification, the level where the wisdom of the practitioner is such that the indication is that he has developed and is developing in the direction of actual wisdom, otherworldly wisdom. So he has achieved a level of having approached and come close to the achieving of otherworldly knowledge, knowledge which knows the true nature of reality.
Tene ta tendawe namda shu tumkinge kongsa tela yang. Tena sherap nintop tanga gogyar depa.
So this type of person would be someone of great courage, of great merit, someone who has achieved a high level of so-called higher knowledge, and someone whose trust and confidence in his master, in his dharma and so on, has developed to a very great extent.
Perna 대변은 주나 라마테게 맨디 추레 세드 추랑 인줄로 타죠 그것이.
So trust and confidence here, conviction as it were, in terms of how this individual views his master, an example which would demonstrate the level of his trust and confidence in his master would be the following, namely, if his master tells him that water is fire, then that is so in the mind of the disciple. He has no doubts or hesitations as to making this his norm. That's the extent of the trust and confidence he has in his master. Now, the secret mantrayana is very vast and profound, and therefore for practitioners to grasp this path, a high level of higher knowledge, trust and confidence and the like, as has been explained, is required. A person who doesn't have that isn't really able to deal with the secret mantrayana. He doesn't have that mindset nor the capacity required in order to be able to properly practice the path in question.
Penna George Parden Adisha Jagal Juba Kabla Consumala Hajang Keva Jagab Kipenda Tsame took this and
Now, the well-known Indian Buddhist master, the noble Atisha, while on the Indian subcontinent, had many contacts with masters of the secret mantrayana while living there, in terms of teaching situations and the like.
Jema Kung Perne Samuel Pep Kabla Samuel Jube Laser ki keto le ben ha ki tenjo den ka dang tenjo so chik zig do ten loben pema la so kwa
Loben
pema jone pema samba wala so be triple loben tenzo ke jagar to meki tene leji
이게 트리버고 간 카레메겐
jagar layang mad Tanda Meki Songa Jude Samu Pujin ne la sopane Jin Tonga Mongo Chik Zig Yong Tu Te Konsonga Hie Sambanga Jalte Chasang Chasang Songa.
And as you probably know, Atisha was accomplished both in learning and meditation, and that held true for the secret mantrayana as well. Now, he later on in life traveled to Tibet and remained there till his death, teaching and spreading the Buddha Dharma. Now, at one point he had visited the monastery of Samye, where the work of translating the Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit to Tibetan had taken place earlier. Thus the monastery of Samye had a very large library with many original Sanskrit manuscripts as to both the sutras and tantras. Part of the collection of the Buddha's word, as well as the collection of commentaries authored by various Buddhist masters, explaining and elucidating the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. The Pema Jungna Tang Trupchen Mangpo Kare Trisha Vatenche.
Mare.
Ona?
Trupchen Mangpo Ki Ujingi Nele Yue Deve.
Ujingi Nele.
Then it Tagan I think Yin the Yin Yue Deve.
Now, during one of his visits there, Atisha's visit, one of his visits to the monastery of Samye, while looking into the contents of the library, Atisha found various manuscripts of many Buddhist tantras that he had never seen earlier, that hadn't been available on the Indian subcontinent prior to him coming to Tibet. And he was amazed by this, realizing that some of those manuscripts had been brought from the land of Udiyana to Tibet by great Indian Buddhist masters of old, Padmasambhava and other Mahasiddhas. This left him amazed and with the realization that his very broad knowledge of the Buddha Dharma in general and the Buddhist Tantras in specific wasn't as broad as he had earlier thought it to be. And therefore, or in consequence of this realization, the pride he had taken in having a very broad knowledge of the Buddha Dharma in general and the Buddhist Tantras in specific, that pride disappeared when he realized that there is so much more to, in specific, the Buddhist Tantras than he had known it to be.
Daga Nashin Ge Nintop Bichane Songa Yamin Jinkin Tella Send the Lu Tatarang Dongsen Lameka Nangina Kana Yotepa Meba Dongne Reshed and Rotten Pinjakoviot.
Now, in terms of someone truly capable of practicing this path, that of the Vajrayana, it requires a person who is of the courage it takes to, on the spot, turn his back on the world, leave everything behind, and go to a specific place, isolated place, to meditate with the only goal of attaining enlightenment, if his master tells him to do so.
That's one of the Kona Yamin Sursin the Cheda, Lokashanan, Rebuji, Yung Tugaduga.
Now, if a person has this type of courage, and the perseverance it takes to do what he has been told to do by his master, then it is possible to attain Buddha the enlightened state within a couple of years.
Perna, Tangaran, Nar, Tandaran, Chabu Gazes Chashana, Lama Tsewan Chashana, controlling. Good young tired doja Shenje, tired doja Java Jams in Yamni cheese, Takashi Nang Yusarwa. Then Nang ne, then Santa sent the little tongue. Kanga Yane, the longa, Pena, Ya some Judu Labdua. Never matter part of tongue and Zushalins, Nalajava Kayang Mets.
There is an example that Sanji Gopang told you.
Sanji Gopang top men a young, Pena Tonam Gishi Julie Orwa, Tarba top Sarwa.
Now, there is an example of a recent person having had this type of courage. His name is Lama Tsewan. He lived in France and he died a couple of weeks back. Now, he was a student of the present Karmapa, Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, who a couple of years back, it seems to be about 5 years back, had told Lama Tsewan to do a meditation retreat, meditating on the Yidam known as Gyalva Gyamtso, which Lama Tsewan had decided to do. It appears he had mentioned or said that, well, this is what I'll do until I attain the proper result, which would be minimum liberation from samsara. Now, he then, for a period of approximately the last 5 years, did just this meditation in retreat, and he died a couple of weeks back, seated in meditation for quite some time after his death, indicating that he has at least attained liberation from a worldly rebirth. He has attained liberation from samsara. If not Buddha, then one can't say which level someone attains. However, there are various levels of realization, and the lower level would be that of liberation from samsara.
Today into Maran Soge, Tepa, Ninto, Sherab Nuna, Songak one sinipa, Sherab, Songak one sinipa Kurtunki, Maranso Lama Yedwa.
So, we do have access to, and we are connected with a master who has the capacity to give proper empowerment, advice and the like. So whether or to what extent that will benefit us depends upon our trust and confidence in the master, our level of courage and our level of higher knowledge.
Lasso, Tene, Tat Tendeg Dorcha take Patige, Gambrim to Song do.
So, to get back to the third of the 4 points, which is about, in this chapter, the various stages of meditation in the secret mantrayana.
Te Song Yon do, Ta Song Chirtan Song La Jude Jisegi, you are rete, Perla, Ta Chuju Jika, Yamlin Zo, de Lamit Yamlin Nangi.
Now, within the Buddhist Tantras, you have 4 categories of types of Tantra. the highest being referred to as the unparalleled class of Tantra. And in Tibet, it's this category of Buddhist Tantras that, or in Tibetan Buddhism, it's this category of Buddhist Tantras that are practiced the most, that are most common.
Ta ti che yong de ta song la yu ne song chu la dan da chi la yang dan yi yi xian song yo zhe ben na yu de den zo na la chi ji la dan yi xie ge yo zhe.
Well, furthermore, in Dadi Lamina Karina, what is going to be explained now pertains to all classes of Tantra. And that is the following, namely, with respect to the words that set forth the various Buddhist Tantras, each of the words, the key terms, has 4 meanings or takes 4 perspectives. Spelling?
Yeah.
Yes. Now Khenpo Rinpoche will go into those details in tomorrow's lecture, because we won't have time to go through these 4 perspectives today. It's not enough time left. Det tilling Mari. Sani Malasa.
Sunam de ye tam che zekba ni tom ne nye be ranam pam che che ga na che balap chubwa ye sikbe chole rowa sho like so